So, you fully grasp that you are facing 2 separate counts of first-degree murder, correct? Yeah, I get what you are saying. The charges are about killing both of my kids. Right. Look, I realize this is an incredibly heavy situation for you right now. When we think of the most horrific crimes in Canadian history, we usually picture strangers, drifters, or hardened felons. But in these cases, the monster was mother. Women wired to nurture who chose to destroy life instead. These stories shatter us because they violate the most fundamental law of nature. A parent protects their young. From coast to coast, communities have been left reeling. Whether in quiet suburbs or tight-knit towns where everyone knows your name, each tragedy forces the public to ask not just how, but why. What pushes a mother to do the unthinkable? Is it psychosis, despair, revenge, or something far more sinister? In this episode, we are peeling back the layers on the most disturbing cases where Canadian mothers crossed that line and the devastation left in their wake. Before we dive in, I want to know your take. Is there ever any context that explains a mother ending her child's life? Drop your opinion in the comments and hit subscribe to join us as we confront the true face of evil in Canada. Let's go to Millet, Alberta. It is February 2010. Curtis McConnell forced the lock on his bathroom door. Inside, the room was silent. In the water, he found his entire world destroyed. 2-year-old Connor and 10-month-old Jaden, both lifeless. His wife's wedding band was sitting on the toilet seat right next to them. Just hours before, Edmonton police had called him. They said Allison was in critical condition after jumping off an overpass. But nobody knew where the boys were until Curtis opened that door. Allison, whose maiden name was Mihir, was an Australian who met Curtis here in Canada. They tied the knot in 2007 and settled south of Edmonton. Connor was born that same year, followed by Jaden in 2009. But by the end of that year, the marriage was crumbling. Court documents reveal a bitter custody battle. Curtis was terrified she would flee back to Australia with the Caraval kids, so he even locked up their passports. Sometime between late January and February 1st, 2010, Allison drowned both boys in the family tub. The exact time of death was never pinned down in court. Afterward, she calmly drove into the city, grabbed a meal, and then threw herself off a bridge, shattering her bones but surviving. When the cop called about the suicide attempt, Curtis rushed home, broke down the bathroom door, and walked into a nightmare. Allison was patched up at the hospital and then moved to a psychiatric facility in Edmonton while the law decided her fate. The funeral for those 2 little boys drew hundreds of mourners from all over central Alberta. The Crown charged her with 2 counts of second-degree murder. The entire trial hinged on her state of mind. Did she deliberately plan to kill them, or was her mind so broken that she couldn't form criminal intent? It was a bench trial, meaning no jury, just Justice Michelle Crichton weighing the facts. The prosecution laid out the timeline: 2 dead children, a failed suicide attempt, and a marriage falling apart. Allison took the stand, claiming she blacked out during the drownings, though she admitted she wanted to die that weekend. The judge ruled there was reasonable doubt regarding murder intent, downgrading the conviction to manslaughter for both deaths. On June 4, 2012, the judge handed down a 6-year sentence. But that wasn't the whole story. With extra credit given for time served in pretrial custody, she only had about 15 months left to serve in a hospital. The public was furious. Officials called it a slap on the wrist, and the Crown immediately filed an appeal. They wanted a new trial or a murder conviction. But after just 10 months of psychiatric confinement, Allison was deported back to Australia in April 2013. She landed in Sydney to a swarm of cameras. Alberta's Justice Minister protested, but couldn't stop her removal. The Canadian prosecutors didn't give up, keeping the appeal alive in hopes of a tougher sentence. But in mid-September 2013, authorities down under confirmed Allison was found dead under a bridge near Gosford. News of her suicide spread through Canada and Australia. The legal battle to bring her to justice was effectively over. The McConnell tragedy stands as a brutal example of what happens when a mental health crisis collides with the justice system. The court decided the evidence wasn't strong enough to call it murder, but that didn't change the fact that a father had to pull his sons from a bathtub. The sentence, 6 years, with most of it written off as time served, sparked a massive debate about whether the system is too soft on killers who claim insanity, incarceration, and if deporting her would completely derail the government's ongoing appeal process. Let's go back to Barrie, Ontario. It's the fall of 2006. On October 3rd, investigators walked into a scene that would haunt them for the rest of their lives. Two young sisters, Serena, barely 3, and her infant sibling Sophia, just 19 months old, were tucked into bed together. They were dressed in matching pink sleepwear, each with a delicate chain resting against her chest. Not far away, a camcorder sat on a table, the red light still blinking. It had captured footage of their mother, Elaine Campion, delivering a hushed message to her ex-husband, Leo. Her demeanor was chillingly composed, almost like she was reading from a script. But in reality, police were staring at the grisly conclusion to one of the most gut-wrenching tragedies the country had ever seen. Elaine Frances Campion started her life in New Brunswick back in 1973. Eventually, she headed west to Ontario in her late 20s, crossing paths with Leo Campion, the man she'd end up marrying. They built a family with 2 daughters, Serena and Sophia, who instantly became the entire focus of her existence. However, by 2005, the relationship had imploded. Those close to them recall constant fighting, thick tension, and a messy legal war over the kids. Elaine was barely hanging on mentally, physically, and with her bank account draining. She was open with medical professionals about her battles with severe anxiety and the black dog of depression. She even confessed to relatives that she felt her grip on reality slipping. By the time summer 2006 rolled around, the girls were mostly living with her. But a court date was looming, and Leo had just filed paperwork to take full guardianship. You could see the panic building in her for weeks. She was terrified of losing the only 2 people in the world who mattered to her. Legal documents revealed that on the night of October 2nd, Elaine ran the water in the tub and let her babies into the washroom. The darkness that took over her thoughts that evening stands as one of the nation's most disturbing ethical horrors. Once the children were gone, she meticulously changed them into fresh pajamas, groomed their hair, and arranged them side by side on the mattress. Then she hit record, staring down the lens to leave a final word for Leo. The footage shows her looking terrifyingly peaceful. She displayed the girls' beloved playthings, professing her deep love for them before uttering the chilling words, "They're with me now." As the sun came up the next day, she dialed 911. First responders rushed to the unit, discovering the bodies in the tape. They slapped cuffs on Elaine right at the spot, hitting her with double charges of first-degree homicide. People in the complex watched in shock as police walked her out. She seemed totally out of it, like a zombie, ignoring everything around her. Barrie is usually a place associated with sleepy streets, not breaking news tickers, but word traveled at lightning speed. Before long, a makeshift memorial of teddy bears, bouquets, and tearful cards started piling up near the entrance. Locals who remembered seeing Elaine taking the kids to the playground just days earlier couldn't wrap their heads around it. It felt like a movie script, not reality, in a quiet corner of Ontario. Detectives in the Crown didn't take long to link the killings to the bitter custody war. Leading up to the tragedy, hearings were on the calendar to decide if Leo would get sole custody. Police discovered a trail of letters Elaine had penned, venting her absolute despair and terror at the thought of the girls being taken away, but they also found proof of premeditation, the video, the necklaces, the farewell notes. The core issue wasn't the act itself, the facts were undeniable. It all came down to the why did she genuinely grasp the reality of her crimes. When court convened 4 years later in 2010, it was standing room only. Elaine, now 35, sat sandwiched between her attorneys, eyes glued to the floor. The prosecution painted a picture of cold calculation, arguing she did it to spite her ex-husband. Her legal team admitted she took their lives, but argued her mind was broken by severe illness, rendering her incapable of understanding the evil of what she did. They brought in shrinks to explain that she was in the grips of psychosis, convinced in her twisted reality that she was actually saving her kids from separation. The Crown fired back with their own specialists, insisting that while she was depressed, she was still lucid enough to know murder was wrong. For 7 grueling weeks, the jury reviewed mountains of evidence, that haunting tape, the letters, and witness accounts. You could see jurors breaking down, wiping away tears as the details were laid out. On November 15, 2010, After deliberating for 2 days, they came back with a guilty on both counts of first-degree murder. Justice Alfred Stong handed down the automatic penalty, life behind bars with no chance of release for 25 years. He called the crime a horrific violation of a mother's duty. Journalists observed that Elaine stood stone-faced, showing almost no emotion as her fate was sealed. Her legal team challenged the conviction, claiming the presiding judge failed to adequately explain the concept of moral wrongfulness, a crucial distinction when the defense rests on mental stability. The Ontario Court of Appeal revisited the matter in 2015, cited legally as R.V. Campion 2015, 67. Ultimately, the higher court stood by the original verdict, affirming that the jury had received proper guidance and that the proof of her intent and conscious decision-making was solid. That judgment is now a cornerstone in Canadian jurisprudence regarding how the justice system navigates the intersection of mental health and criminal responsibility. Years later, as part of her incarceration plan, Parole Board of Canada signed off on strictly monitored temporary leaves brief, supervised outings for counseling and social reintegration. These were purely administrative measures, distinct from actual parole, and had no impact on her 25-year mandatory minimum term. Elaine sits in a cell to this day, with no chance to apply for full release until 2035. The public response to the Campion tragedy was distinct. To one side, she was a villain who betrayed her own flesh and blood. To the other, a shattered soul let down by a safety net that failed to catch her before she snapped. The true horror of this narrative lies not in the violence alone, but in the terrifying normalcy preceding it. A mother fighting to maintain a family unit, a custody battle that spiraled out of control. A specific instant where reality broke under the weight of despair. Lisa Gibson, Winnipeg, Manitoba, July 2013. A tub full of water, 2 dead infants, and a vanished mother. That was the nightmare police walked into at a quiet suburban residence on July 24, 2013. 2-year-old Anna and 3-month-old Nicholas Gibson had been drowned. Their mother, Lisa, was nowhere to be found. For 48 hours, the city held its breath as officers, fire crews, and citizens scoured riverbanks and open fields. Then, on July 27th, her remains were pulled from the Red River, a short distance from her house. Authorities confirmed the worst, a murder-suicide driven by a psychological break. This case rattled the country to its core because the motive wasn't malice. It was hopelessness. Lisa was 32, a professional pharmacist, and by every metric, a doting parent. Witnesses confirmed she adored her kids. However, following the arrival of her son, she began exhibiting symptoms of postpartum depression, a condition that silently strips away rationality. She was under medical care, on a prescription regimen, and had family around her. Violence seemed like an impossibility. Her husband, Philip, had only stepped out that morning to run a few errands. He was gone less than 60 minutes, but when he got back, the house was dead silent. He raced upstairs, shouting for her. The bathroom door was ajar, the sound of water still flowing. There he found Anna and Nicholas. He dialed 911 instantly. Emergency crews were on scene within moments, yet it was too late for the children. Lisa's vehicle was missing. Law enforcement triggered a province-wide alert, worried she was a threat to herself. Choppers scanned the waterways, patrol units swept the neighborhood, and the media broadcast urgent descriptions. 2 days later, on July 27th, a pedestrian near the Alexander Docks noticed a body in the water. Police identified her as Lisa Gibson. The Winnipeg Police Service formally closed the file as a murder-suicide. The chief medical examiner stated there was no need for a public inquest. The timeline was clear, and no further legal action could be taken. Winnipeg was left reeling. The Gibsons' front porch became a shrine of teddy bears, bouquets, and flickering candles. Anonymous letters appeared, saying things like, "Sleep well, little ones. We wish we could have saved you." At the memorial service for all three, hundreds came to pay respects. Philip Gibson stood up, fighting through grief, and said, "Lisa loved these kids more than anything. The woman who did this was not the wife I knew. It was the disease that was in control." In the wake of the disaster, health experts and activists used this moment to demand change. They pushed hard for mandatory postpartum screening, more robust aftercare protocols, and the destigmatization of maternal mental health struggles. The Provincial Health Authority eventually added more crisis resources and home visits. These were small measures designed to ensure no other family had to endure this hell. The story of Lisa Gibson stays with us because it feels so close to home. A caring mom, a fresh start, a picture-perfect life. It serves as a brutal reminder that mental health crises don't always scream. Sometimes they whisper, sometimes they hide behind a smile, and sometimes they end in absolute silence. Penny Boudreau, Bridgewater, Nova Scotia, 2008. On a freezing night in January 2008, frantic mother faced the news cameras in Bridgewater, pleading with the public. Her 12-year-old daughter was gone. Her story was simple. She had stepped away from the vehicle for just a moment, and her daughter had vanished into thin air. The community response was immediate. Beams from flashlights cut through the darkness, and flyers were plastered on every street corner. But when the discovery was made 14 days later, along the banks of the La Have River, it became clear the grieving mother wasn't searching for a lost child. She was concealing a crime. This is the chilling account of Penny Boudreau, a tragedy that shattered Nova Scotia and forced an entire nation to question how maternal instinct could warp into something so lethal. Born in 1974 on the South Shore, Penny navigated life as a single parent by the time she hit her 30s. Her world revolved around Carissa. To the outside observer, they were the picture of an ordinary, small-town existence. Penny scraped by with casual work while her daughter thrived in junior high, a bright spirit who loved animals and dreamed of veterinary medicine. Everything shifted in 2007 when a local mechanic named Vernon Macumber entered the picture. The romance was volatile. Fighting became the new normal, and the household was constantly on edge. The friction often centered on the girl. Prosecutors later revealed Penny's desperate fear. She believed the man would walk away if the domestic chaos didn't settle. In her twisted logic, she began to see her own flesh and blood as the barrier to her romantic happiness. Though Macumber insisted he never demanded a choice be made, the pressure cooker in that small apartment reached a breaking point. By late January 2008, the atmosphere was toxic. On the evening of the 27th, Penny took Carissa for a drive toward the edge of town. Court records would later paint the grim details. She pulled onto a rough track near the water. There, the ultimate betrayal took place, a violent assault on her own child. Using a length of twine, she ended the girl's life. Then came the cold calculation of the cover-up. She planted boots in the snow, a prop to suggest a child who had simply wandered off into the winter night. At 8:30, the call went out. The frantic mother act began, and Bridgewater sprang into action immediately. Woods were scoured, neighbors knocked on doors, and the airwaves broadcast the urgent plea for help. Penny faced the television cameras, tears flowing, begging for her daughter's safe return. Nobody guessed the monster was the one holding the microphone. For a fortnight, terror gripped the town. Families bolted their latches, terrified a predator was snatching children from the streets. The hunt spanned miles along the icy La Have, with divers braving the freezing depths to check the shoreline. Rescue teams refused to quit, even as the mercury plunged to -15 degrees. Then, on February 9, 2008, a walker in Conquerall Bank noticed a shape on the snowy slope. Tucked down the steep embankment lay the grim reality. Authorities verified the town's worst nightmare. It was Carissa. Hope evaporated, replaced by crushing grief as memorials and candles piled up at the school. Messages of sorrow accumulated, mourning a young life stolen too soon, with notes reading, "Rest easy, sweet girl." Yet, away from the public eye, detectives started dissecting the mother's narrative. Local police and the RCMP combined forces. Cracks in Penny's timeline began to show almost instantly. Stories shifted, details blurred. To get the truth, they deployed a classic Canadian undercover tactic. They initiated a Mr. Big operation, a high-stakes ruse creating a fake crime syndicate to earn her trust. Operatives befriended her, building a rapport designed to draw out the dark secret she was hiding. Eventually, she spilled everything to her new friends, admitting to the killing and explaining the twisted motive. The wires caught every word, and the confession aligned perfectly with the forensic evidence found at the river. Faced with the tapes, her facade crumbled. June 2008 saw her in handcuffs, charged with first-degree murder. The revelation stunned the province. The community felt betrayed, punched in the gut by the truth. The realization that the very woman they had comforted was the architect of the horror left scars that would not heal. By January 2009, the courthouse was overflowing for the final reckoning. Dressed simply, she barely whispered her admission: guilty of second-degree murder. The Crown laid it bare. The car ride, the struggle, and the staged disappearance were all read into the record. It was a cold move to erase the one thing she felt blocked her relationship. Justice Margaret Stewart handed down the mandate: life behind bars, with no chance of freedom for 20 years. When given the floor, her final words were a hollow whisper: "I am sorry." Moments before being led away, a heavy silence crushed the courtroom gallery. While some family members wept openly, others simply looked away, unable to bear the sight. Outside, the victim's father, Paul Boudreau, spoke to the press, stating that no prison term could ever restore his daughter's life. But he prayed this tragedy would serve as a stark warning of the destruction caused when rage and despair eclipse reason. The shockwaves of this crime left permanent scars across Nova Scotia. Bridgewater, a tight-knit community of fewer than 10,000 souls, had never witnessed such darkness. The very residents who had combed the woods for a missing child now felt a profound sense of betrayal. Volunteers spoke of sleepless nights and crushing guilt, haunted by the realization that they had been helping the murderer while trying to save the victim. Following her guilty verdict, Penny was incarcerated at the Nova Institution for Women in Truro. She kept her head down for years, quietly attending counseling sessions and religious programs. Under Canadian law, specifically the Corrections and Conditional Release Act, even though serving life sentences may apply for escorted temporary absences, brief, supervised trips for rehabilitation purposes long before parole is even an option. In 2019, the Parole Board of Canada granted her request for supervised visits to a church nearby. These outings were not freedom. They were strictly monitored steps toward rehabilitation. However, in April 2024, news broke regarding further supervised privileges, once again igniting public outrage and confusion over the leniency of the system. By June 2025, although day parole was refused, the board approved a 60-day unescorted temporary absence, permitting her limited community access. She remained a prisoner, but the decision was enough to reopen the national wound regarding the balance between second chances and punishment. Whenever her face reappeared in the headlines, the province relived the trauma. One side of the debate insisted that redemption is a pillar of the Canadian legal framework, believing even the worst offenders are capable of reform. The opposing view held that some atrocities, particularly the murder of one's own flesh and blood, should strip a person of that right forever. The saga of Penny and Carissa transcends simple jealousy or despair. It reveals the terrifying fragility of the human mind, how a single flash of panic, a warped thought, can transform maternal love into lethal violence. Now, to Samantha Kamach in Manitoba, the Phoenix Sinclair tragedy, 2005. When the RCMP raided a messy apartment in Fisher River, Manitoba, in 2006, they were searching for a 5-year-old girl missing from the public eye for months. Her name was Phoenix Sinclair, a vibrant, laughing little girl, remembered by neighbors for her bright smile and small pink backpack. But what officers found was a nightmare. Phoenix had been dead for nearly a year, her remains concealed in a shallow grave near the town dump. Her mother, Samantha Kamach, and her boyfriend, Carl McKay, had continued to cash the child's welfare checks, carrying on their lives as if the little girl never existed. It took 2 years for the justice system to render a verdict, and nearly a decade for the province to comprehend how a 5-year-old could disappear in plain view. Phoenix came into the world on April 23, 2000, in Winnipeg. Her short life was defined by chaos, abandonment, and a revolving door of interventions by Child and Family Services. Official inquiries later exposed that Phoenix was removed from her home multiple times in her infancy, often for months, only to be handed back to her parents despite clear red flags about her safety. Her mother, Samantha Kamach, born in 1975, carried her own baggage. She was raised in the foster system, left school early, and fought a lifelong war against poverty and addiction. By 2004, she had partnered with Carl McKay, a man with a documented history of domestic violence. That year, Phoenix was returned to her mother's care for the very last time. Within months of this reunion, the little girl's world became a prison. Witnesses would later testify that the child was rarely seen outdoors. On the rare occasions she was spotted, she looked frail, battered, and terrified. McKay and Kamach cut her off from society, coercing her to address them as mom and dad while forcing her to call herself a bad girl. Detectives would eventually piece together a horrific timeline of systematic abuse and starvation. By June 2005, the beatings intensified, and she was locked in the freezing basement of their home on the Fisher River First Nation, 200 kilometers north of Winnipeg. One of these assaults ended her life. Court documents estimate Phoenix died between June 11th and June 15th, 2005. Rather than seeking medical aid, Kamach and McKay wrapped her tiny body in plastic sheeting and buried her by the landfill. They spun a lie to friends, claiming Phoenix was staying with family. For 9 long months, they stole public funds meant for her care and moved around without raising an eyebrow. The truth of Phoenix's fate remained a secret until March 2006, when a suspicious relative finally called the authorities. Realizing the child had not been seen or heard from in almost a year, the RCMP immediately opened a missing person file, spiraling into a nightmare. On March 27, 2006, following intense interrogation of both suspects, detectives were directed to a desolate area near the Fisher River landfill. Buried beneath layers of ice and dirt, they uncovered human remains, eventually identified through DNA analysis as Phoenix Sinclair. The grim revelation shook Manitoba to its core. Investigators called it one of the most haunting crime scenes they had ever worked. The public was furious, demanding to understand how a 5-year-old girl could disappear from her mother's custody without the safety net raising a single alarm. Police arrested Samantha Kamach and Carl McKay that very week, slapping them with charges of first-degree murder and forcible confinement. Both were refused bail and remained behind bars awaiting trial. The story dominated headlines nationwide, and for months on end, the child's picture was plastered across every major paper. In the snapshot, Phoenix beams with a gap-toothed smile, a poignant symbol of the innocence she was robbed of. Legal proceedings kicked off in December 2007, stretching into 2008. The case against them was damning. A parade of witnesses, comprising former acquaintances and neighbors, took the stand, testifying that McKay and Kamach treated the child like an animal. One resident described hearing gut-wrenching sobs and what sounded like torture sessions, including locking the girl in a cellar for endless hours starved of food. Prosecutors contended that the killing wasn't a snap decision, but a calculated, months-long execution. They painted Kamach and McKay as sadistic disciplinarians who inflicted relentless mental and physical abuse until Phoenix's body gave out. The defense tried to pin the blame on mental impairment and emotional volatility, but the jury didn't buy it. On December 12, 2008, they convicted both Samantha Kamach and Carl McKay on all counts. The judge handed down mandatory life sentences with no chance of parole for 25 years, the stiffest punishment available under Canadian law. The presiding justice labeled the abuse as among the most grotesque ever seen in the nation's legal history. Yet, the verdict didn't silence the questions. How were so many red flags ignored? Why did Child and Family Services hand Phoenix back to her abuser despite countless warnings from caregivers and social workers? The widespread anger birthed the Phoenix Sinclair Inquiry, a massive investigation into child welfare that would become a landmark in Canadian history. Spanning nearly 3 years, starting in 2011, the probe heard from over 120 people. Social workers, law enforcement, and relatives peeled back the layers of a broken system, revealing massive caseloads, shoddy documentation, and non-existent safety checks. Published in January 2014, the final report was damning. The safety net had failed Phoenix completely. It highlighted how her file was shut without proper verification, how home visits never happened, and how alarms were muted. The provincial government issued a formal apology, vowed to overhaul the system, promising better supervision, modernized tracking tools, and more staff on the ground. Ultimately, Phoenix's tragedy is about more than two monsters. It represents a collective failure, her murder forced the entire country to confront the deep flaws in its protective services, asking how red tape and apathy allowed a 5-year-old girl to vanish and die without anyone noticing. Katrina Effort, Wetaskiwin, Alberta, 2005. When residents of this quiet town saw emergency crews descend on a local house in April 2005, they thought someone was sick. They had no idea that a newborn baby boy had just been discovered dead, bundled in linens, and discarded over a neighbor's fence. The mother was 19-year-old Katrina Effort, a reserved girl who had kept her condition a secret from the entire world, her own family included. The aftermath would spark one of the most controversial legal battles in the nation, testing the boundaries of infanticide laws, mental health defenses, and criminal responsibility during a psychotic break. Katrina was raised in a humble home in Wetaskiwin, roughly 70 kilometers south of Edmonton. By all accounts, she was a quiet, polite, and industrious teen who flew under the radar. Come 2004, she was holding down a part-time job and living at home. Unbeknownst to a soul, she fell pregnant. For 9 months, she managed to hide her growing bump under baggy outfits, fooling her colleagues, friends, and family. Court documents later revealed she never went for a single checkup, leaving her parents entirely in the dark. According to the facts presented at trial, Katrina went into labor alone in her room in the dead of night, while her parents slept just through the wall. Immediately after the birth, she took a towel, strangled the infant, and later She swaddled the infant in layers of towels, secured the bundle with elastic bands, and abandoned him, hurling the small body over the backyard fence into the neighbor's property. By the following morning, she continued her daily routine as if nothing had occurred. It took another 2 days before she sought medical attention for severe pain and hemorrhaging, which led the staff to the undeniable conclusion that she had just delivered a child. Authorities were notified instantly. Within hours, officers from the Royal Canadian Mounted Police discovered the baby's remains. Katrina was taken into custody right there at the hospital, facing charges of second-degree murder and committing an indignity to human remains. The incident immediately polarized the nation. To some, this was a calculated, heartless act of violence. Others perceived a terrified young woman paralyzed by denial. Court-ordered psychiatric evaluations depicted her as emotionally stunted, overwhelmed, and drowning in postpartum trauma, although she did not meet the legal criteria for insanity. In 2006, a jury at the Court of Queen's Bench in Wetaskiwin convicted Katrina of second-degree murder, handing down a sentence of life in prison with no chance of parole for 10 years. However, the verdict sat uneasily, with many who questioned if the jury had fully grasped Canada's infanticide laws, which acknowledge that a mother's judgment can be severely compromised following childbirth. Her legal team challenged the conviction, contending that the evidence of her mental fragility should have been the focal point, not a footnote. By 2009, the Alberta Court of Appeal overturned the murder conviction and mandated a retrial, citing that the instructions given to the jury failed to properly clarify the option of a lesser infanticide charge. The proceedings resumed in 2011, presided over by Justice Joanne Veit. After a thorough review of the medical records and forensic data, Justice Veit determined that Katrina's conduct, while devastating, aligned with the legal definition of infanticide rather than murder. Her written ruling noted, the accused's mind was disturbed by the biological effects of birthing, thereby reducing her moral and legal responsibility at the time of the event. Consequently, the conviction was downgraded to infanticide. Her punishment was a suspended sentence, with 3 years of probation effectively, 0 jail time. The decision ignited a firestorm of controversy. The public was furious, viewing the outcome as a slap on the wrist for killing a newborn. News outlets across the nation ran bold banners screaming, "No jail for mother who killed her baby." This drew attention to Section 233 of the Criminal Code, which states that if a mother causes the death of her newborn while her mind is unbalanced due to the effects of childbirth or lactation, the crime is deemed infanticide, an offense capped at 5 years in prison. Katrina's trial became the defining test of this statute for the modern era. It highlighted the difficult friction between compassion for postpartum mental illness and the public's demand for accountability. Prosecutors reviewed the outcome but ultimately decided against an appeal to the Supreme Court. Katrina finished her probation quietly and faded into obscurity. Today, her story is a staple in Canadian law, schools, used to illustrate the nuanced distinctions between homicide charges and the way the justice system navigates postpartum psychosis. Then, between 2008 and 2010 in Calgary, another dark story emerged involving Meredith Catherine Borowick. It was October 2010 when a tenant in a Calgary complex picked up the sound of whimpering from a garbage bin out back. Investigating the noise, they discovered a newborn inside, swaddled in towels and discarded amidst the refuse, clinging to life. Miraculously, that infant survived. Investigators quickly tracked the forensic trail, which led them straight to the door of Meredith Borowick, a 27-year-old who appeared disturbingly detached when questioned. However, the detectives were about to uncover a horror far deeper than this single incident. Two previous babies, born in 2008 and 2009, had met the same fate, though neither of them had survived. The ensuing investigation revealed a chilling cycle of secret pregnancies, rattling even the most seasoned officers and eventually triggering a Supreme Court decision that would reshape the legal understanding of infanticide. A Calgary native, Meredith seemed entirely ordinary. Those who knew her described a shy, introverted woman who seemed to have her life together. She shared a home with her boyfriend and held a steady job at a call center. Outwardly, there was zero evidence of chaos, no visible baby bumps, no cries for help. Yet, in private, Meredith was maintaining a staggering deception. Over a 3-year span, she carried 3 children to term, effectively masking every pregnancy from her boyfriend, family, and peers. Legal documents later detailed her methods, wearing baggy outfits and strategically withdrawing from social events as her due dates approached, citing sickness or overtime. Then came October 19, 2010, when a neighbor at her building heard that distinct cry near the dumpsters. The neighbor peered into the waste bin, uncovering a newborn male swaddled in a towel, the umbilical cord still intact. Emergency responders sped the infant to Foothills Medical Center, where staff determined the child was merely hours old, yet miraculously in stable condition. Law enforcement immediately scoured the surrounding neighborhood, questioning residents and pulling security camera tapes. By nightfall, detectives zeroed in on Borowick's apartment. Shortly after, crime scene investigators uncovered blood evidence in both the hallway and bathroom, strongly suggesting a recent delivery. Authorities took her into custody that same evening, slapping her with charges of child abandonment and attempted murder. During the initial interrogation, Borowick feigned ignorance about the baby. However, once confronted with undeniable forensic proof, she cracked and claimed the child. Then came the bombshell. She admitted this wasn't an isolated incident. She had secretly birthed children before. She confessed that in 2008 and 2009, she delivered babies solo in her bathroom, bagged them up, and discarded them like refuse. Neither infant survived. In the agreed statement of facts later presented to the court, she claimed an overwhelming sense of panic drove her actions, convinced that nobody would grasp her situation. Investigators never found the remains of the first 2 children. Following these admissions, the prosecution upgraded Borowick's charges to 2 counts of second-degree murder regarding the newborns from 2008 and 2009, alongside the attempted murder charge for the survivor in 2010. Prosecutors contended that these were calculated acts. Hiding 3 separate pregnancies, they argued, demonstrated clear intent and cognitive awareness. Her defense team argued otherwise, claiming her mind was unraveled by the birthing process fitting the specific criteria outlined in Canadian infanticide statutes. They insisted she acted out of sheer confusion and panic, not cold-blooded malice. Court-mandated mental health assessments concluded she wasn't psychotic. Instead, she likely suffered from severe dissociation and a complete emotional disconnect right after labor. The trial moved to the Court of Queen's Bench of Alberta. Finally, in November of 2014, Justice Peter McIntyre delivered his verdict, convicting Borowick on 2 counts of infanticide regarding the earlier deaths, while clearing her of the attempted murder charge regarding the infant found in 2010. The magistrate determined her mental condition satisfied the statutory definition of infanticide, acknowledging her mind was compromised by the physical and hormonal storm of childbirth. Justice McIntyre noted that although she acted largely on purpose, her capacity for rational thought was heavily obscured by the after effects of labor. The punishment, 18 months behind bars plus 3 years of probation. The prosecution wasn't satisfied and filed an appeal, asserting the judge interpreted mental disturbance far too leniently. This legal battle climbed all the way to the Supreme Court of Canada in 2016, cited as R.V. Borowiak. In a ruling penned by Justice Michael Moldaver, the High Court unanimously affirmed the original verdict. The saga captivated the nation, equal parts horrifying and legally intricate. While many citizens were appalled by what they saw as a slap on the wrist, legal experts maintained it was a correct application of the law as written. Borowiak served her time and re-entered society under watch. Since 2016, she has largely faded from the headlines. Alberta justice officials later verified she successfully adhered to all her probationary terms. Now, shifting to Conception Bay South, Newfoundland, August 18, 2003. It was roughly 1:30 in the morning when a runner near a quiet fishing wharf noticed something odd in the surf. Responding officers discovered the lifeless bodies of a woman and her 13-month-old son floating face down in the chilly Atlantic. The toddler was Zachary Turner. The woman was his mother, Dr. Shirley Jane Turner, a general practitioner, fighting extradition to the U.S. for the slaying of Zachary's father. Autopsy results later revealed Shirley had sedated the boy, bound him to her torso with a sweater, and walked into the sea. This event stands as one of the most catastrophic blunders in Canadian legal history, not merely for the tragedy of the act, but because the system had every chance to prevent it. Shirley Turner was born in 1961 in St. Anthony, Newfoundland. Intelligent and driven, she chased a medical career, starting her studies locally before finishing her residency across the border. By the late 90s, while practicing in Iowa and subsequently Pennsylvania, she started dating Dr. Andrew Bagby. Their romance was toxic, defined by obsessive behavior and a cycle of breakups. In 2001, when Andrew finally cut ties permanently, Turner drove over 1,500 kilometers from Iowa to Pennsylvania to confront him at his job. The following morning, Andrew Bagby's body was discovered in a park near Latrobe, Pennsylvania, riddled with 5 bullets. Detectives immediately zeroed in on Shirley Turner. Witnesses placed her car nearby, and her phone logs. Phone records painted a disturbing picture of obsession, logging call after call to Andrew's place and office the very evening before he was murdered. By the time American detectives secured a warrant, Shirley was gone. She had slipped across the border, retreating to safety in St. John's, Newfoundland. It wasn't until December of 2001 that the law caught up with her. Canadian officials arrested her on an extradition request, but while waiting for the hearings, she dropped a bombshell that threw a wrench in the entire legal process. She was carrying Andrew's baby. That changed the game completely. Attorneys on both sides of the border agreed to hit pause on sending her back until the infant was born. On July 18, 2002, Shirley delivered a baby boy, naming him Zachary Andrew Turner. Andrew's grieving parents, Kathleen and David Bagby, wasted no time filing for custody, terrified of what might happen to that little boy. What followed was a year-long nightmare in the courts, a tug-of-war between the grandparents desperate to save their son's child, and Shirley, who held on to primary guardianship despite literally facing charges for killing the boy's father. Ignoring desperate pleas from U.S. officials and police warnings, the Newfoundland justice system granted Shirley bail not once, but twice in 2002 and 2003. The reasoning? She wasn't likely to run and had a clean slate in Canada. The court ordered therapy sessions and routine check-ins, but let's be real, the oversight was minimal at best. In reality, nobody was watching closely. She kept her son and had total freedom to be with him whenever she wanted. David and Kathleen were living in a constant state of fear, but they played along. They had to make nice with the woman they believed killed their son just to get a few precious moments with their grandson. By the summer of 2003, the clock was running out. The extradition order was back on track. Turner was told she had to turn herself in within weeks. But on the night of August 17, 2003, she made a different choice. She fed Zachary a fatal cocktail of drugs, bound him to her chest with an old sweater, and marched straight into the freezing Atlantic at Conception Bay. When search teams found them the next morning, it was too late. Forensics revealed the little guy was already knocked out before they hit the water. It was a murder-suicide. The public was furious. How does a system allow a woman accused of first-degree murder to walk free on bail and playhouse with a baby? The horror of it all forced the government to launch a massive investigation, led by the Child and Youth Advocate. In October 2006, the province published the Turner Review, a 3-volume deep dive into every single red flag the system managed to ignore. The report was damning. Sloppy risk assessments, zero talk between U.S. and Canadian agencies, and a total failure to protect the child despite blinking warning lights everywhere. The conclusion was heartbreakingly simple. Zachary Turner did not have to die. The inquiry demanded a complete overhaul of how bail and child welfare work when heavy criminal charges are in the mix. Because of this report, Newfoundland and Labrador rewrote the rulebook, mandating that social services and the Justice Department actually talk to each other if a parent is accused of violence. The tragedy also reshaped Canada's entire approach to bail reviews, forcing judges to prioritize the safety of children above the freedom of the accused. David and Kathleen didn't stop fighting. They turned their grief into a crusade for change, penning the book Dance with the Devil, which laid bare the incompetence that cost them their grandson. Their nightmare was later immortalized in the gut-wrenching documentary Dear Zachary, a cinematic letter to a boy who never got to know his dad. To this day, stories of mothers turning on their own children haunt Canadians, because it shatters our most basic instinct that a mother is supposed to be a protector, not a predator. These cases force us to confront the uncomfortable truth that evil isn't always a stranger in a dark alley. Sometimes the danger is sitting right at the breakfast table. We might never fully grasp the psychology that drives a caregiver to kill, but by keeping these names alive, we ensure their memories don't just fade into the archives. I want to hear your take. How do you process cases where the person who gave life decides to take it away? And if you're looking for more deep dives into Canadian true crime, hit that subscribe button for Redacted Minutes to get daily updates that keep these important discussions going.